Okay, welcome to episode 38 of the Following Mechanical Turks project. Today, we're going to be looking at draft hits that we've produced. So we're in the second product here. We're looking at questions of readability, probably, and how these manifest in the composition of and response to hits themselves. So we've got a couple of drafts that we want to take a look at and reconcile. Ultimately, we want to, produce actual hits, actual documents so that we can submit them for IRB approval. We do have some funding, and I had a meeting about that earlier this week. So we just need to make sure things go through IRB, and then we can move forward with submitting or posting our hits. Is there anything I'm overlooking here?
I think so. That sounds good.
All right, well, let's just get into it then. As we talked about last time that, maybe it would be preferable to have multiple rounds of hits. So we're not just submitting the same stuff or different variants of the same stuff, but a couple of different things doing different jobs. And one thing that'll let us do is allow Turkers to help compose the hits themselves in particular ways. So I think we both were kind of looking at multiple rounds of different hits. I'm going to share something with you here. Excuse me. Okay. So this is sort of what I came up with, and it requires a little bit of explication here. But as I mentioned, there's two rounds. And in the first round, the actual composition of the hit itself is first, the hit is going to be compensated higher. Our guidance from the ethical guidelines we looked up about using Mechanical Turk in research, they're a few years old, but they suggested, if I'm not mistaken, a dime a minute, right? I anticipate this first round of hits not taking that long. I mean, maybe a couple of minutes, and we'll kind of talk about why, but not very long. I mean, I didn't want these hits to take a long time for a couple of reasons. So one reason why the way they're structured the way they are is I didn't want, for example, the same person doing kind of multiple questions, like a lot of questions. There's just going to be a few questions, so they can do it and kind of focus on that and then move on. So the compensation, as I say, I imagine he's taking a couple of minutes. I was thinking, probably like $1 or so, which, by our guidelines would be 10 minutes. I don't think it'll take anywhere near that. I anticipate, maybe 5 minutes, but that is probably longer than you need. So it would be compensated at, at least double the ethical rate. Anywho, we can talk about that. That's kind of fine-grained stuff. So the actual composition of the hit would be, first, it would start with a boilerplate statement about the study, that it's been through IRB and, potentially even a number, an IRB number. And then a notice on this one that the written responses produced will be or could be used in later hits, just letting people know that their work will be used in that format later, which I think would be necessary to let them know, right? We're not just getting your feedback and then digesting it. What you write will be used later. Heads up. It's really, kind of nothing more than a heads up. So boilerplate statement. Then the question itself, there'll be 4 versions of this, at least, as I've drafted it. drafted it. And you wouldn't be doing all of these, right? It says, right, one of the following. So there'd be 4 versions of this hit devoted to one of these 4 questions, or prompts, I should say. So one of them is a 1-sentence summary of a written paragraph. One is a 1-sentence summary or caption, and we'll talk about the difference there, for an image, right? So we'll either provide a written paragraph, and it'll be the same written paragraph, a 1-sentence summary or caption for an image, and it'll be the same image because we want people discussing the same media elements there for the second hit. I qualify this here. Captioning is mentioned in the hit data, but it's way down there. So, we talked with Sean about captioning and the kind of language we should use here. And a lot of what I'm pulling from comes from the first product, right? The concepts that emerged in the first product.
Yeah.
So summary shows up a lot. Captioning is in there, but not very much at all. It's way down in the findings. Also, that would, if we use the language of captioning, it would change. If we're wanting summary, and then caption here, it potentially changes what we're asking for. So anywho, it's just something to be aware of when we make our decisions here.
Yeah.
Sorry, did you have?
No, I mean, I hadn't really thought of that angle. I'd been thinking in terms of like alt text descriptions as opposed to captions. But you're right, there probably should be, or at least think through how this second product flows from the first one and what kinds of terms we were noticing in the corpus. So yeah, no, I'm just mostly making noises about the thought that it just occurred to me.
Yeah, I mean, and any of them are options. It kind of addresses what do we want it to do. But anyway, the way to think of this as, there's kind of 4 variants. One is summary of the written paragraph. One is summary or caption of an image. One is summary of an audio clip scene. So this one is kind of interesting because, as we discussed with Sean, we wouldn't want to say something like captioning for the audio, because then what you get is a transcription. And as we talked about with him, mostly what he's looking at tends to be kind of transcriptions with light aspects of summary. So like, it'll have in parentheses or square brackets, crowd noises or something like that. But it doesn't really describe scenes, because really, how could it?
Yeah.
I mean, the amount of data you'd be getting, and kind of at this simultaneously, to have a conversation that's being transcribed, but also audio description of, by the way, they're in a restaurant and there's emotional baggage between,
Right. There's an ironic poster on. Yeah. Right. Yeah.
So, but what we want would be a summary of the audio clip, not a transcription, because if we're asking for transcription, I mean, we could do that, but that's addressing a different aspect of readability. That's addressing the transcription or extraction aspect of readability, right? In the first product, we talk about the sort of different notions of readability. Excuse me. And one is mechanical legibility. You can actually decrypt the signs on something, or the letters on something, right? The more mechanical or machinic notion of readability. At the other, I don't know if it's a pull, but the other aspect of readability is comprehension readability. This document is readable. What I'm saying they're not is that it's legible, but that I'm able to get information out of it readily, or it holds my interest or whatever. So anywho, what I think we want here is a 1-sentence summary of an audio clip, not a transcription. And, potentially that prompt would need to clarify a one sentence summary description, not a transcription, of this audio clip scene. And I don't imagine this clip being longer than something like, 5 to 10 seconds. This isn't going to be minutes, and it speaks to sort of how long this should take you to do. It's a brief, some seconds audio clip. I haven't selected these things yet because I didn't want to bother to do this if we needed to change or tweak what we're doing here. But, you got to read a paragraph. That'll take you, a couple of minutes to read a paragraph and then write a summary. The image one probably would go quicker because it's an image. So you can write a summary of what's happening in the image probably a little bit more quickly. Maybe 10 seconds of an audio clip, summarize what that scene is. And then the same thing for a video clip. Again, we're talking 5 to 10 seconds here. Summarize what's going on there. Again, not a transcription. And then I was kind of grappling with this notion of these kind of metadata questions. We talked about this a lot last time.
Yeah.
Do we really, what is it we actually want here? And this is something I think Kagel talked about with us a lot. What is it you actually want here? Do you actually want their summaries? And to an extent, we do actually want their summaries because those summaries are going to feed forward into the next hit. So it's like, yeah, those summaries are important. But do we also want some metadata aspects about Turker's interaction with the hit you've given them, right? I mean, one aspect we do get back is their statements, right? I mean, their summaries. So that tells us something about the hit itself. Because you'll notice here, I had sort of these questions about the hits. Things like, was this a good use of your time? Were you fairly compensated? And some of those, I think, are relevant. At the same time, some of them are communicated through their answers to the hit itself.
That's what I was just thinking, right? And also, right, if you get really into it, was this good use of your time answering the question, was this a good use of your time? Because the Turk thinking, I completed the hit, right? That's, I think as you're suggesting, my taking up of this hit is a function of the answer of the first 3 questions.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah, and so like, were the instructions clear? Looks like we got a little visitor there. So like, were the instructions clear? If they produced summaries, then it seems like, well, yes. I mean, we don't necessarily need to interview them.
Right.
About, sort of metadata, some metadata aspects, or things like, how long did this take you? I think we get that report. I mean, it's like, we don't need to ask them about this, but some of these maybe bear asking. So something like, why did you select this hit? Now, that does address an aspect of readability, but it's the readability of our post itself, right? Because one thing we noticed in the first product, and we got feedback about this, was that some hits persist on Mechanical Turk because they're poorly written, right? Not all of them, but some of them are poor hits because they're either confusing or you just don't want to waste your time trying to understand what they're asking for. Because, you can submit your hit and then it still not be accepted. And then it's like, well, I wasted my time trying to do this one. That's not the only reason they persist, but it is a reason. So some notion of why did you select this hit speaks to the readability of the hit we generated itself, right? So there may be some value in getting an answer to this. And it seems like the only way to get an answer to this is to ask somebody.
Yeah. Well, and 2, it gets at, right, that we could assume that their taking up of the hit answers some of these questions, but there's also a sense in which we want them to additionally have to articulate it, right? If we're trying to get at something. you're right. It would be interesting to see what. Yeah, I still think it's worth asking, even if we could assume from their completion of the hit that they thought it was worth their time, clearly written and fairly compensated.
Well, and seeing the rest of these are kind of, or most of them are kind of like yes, no, they're binary.
Yeah.
And so it's sort of like at the other end, it's sort of like, what value does this? I mean, I can imagine sitting down with these results and seeing like a whole bunch of yeses and nos, or maybe like, all yeses and a no or whatever, and being like, what do I do with this? It's like, I've got it. And now I'm not quite sure what to do with it. Anyway, this
Right.
one does ask for a discursive answer. It's like, well, why did you select this? And so also this means like, we wouldn't want to read through thousands of these, right?
Yeah.
These would want to be, you'd want them to be constrained. So I was conscious of that as well. It's like, if I'm asking you to write something,
Yeah.
I'm not going to be getting a lot of hits on that, because I'm just not going to be able to go through it really appropriately. I mean, we can feed them into a machine reader again, as we did previously. That's an option, but whatever.
Yeah. At this stage, anything that we have them do is something that we're going to have to do something with. That's right.
Yeah.
We'll be in the position of the writing instructor at the end of the semester going, I have all this grading to do. It's like, well, you assigned the essay.
Yeah. Well, so that underscores this first hit, the question of like, well, how many of each 4 of these do I want? How many one-sentence summaries of this written paragraph do I want? And my thinking there was, well, not a whole ton, because for one thing, if these feed forward into the second round of hits, we're going to be asking people to pick out the most readable or accurate or precise one or whatever.
Yeah.
There may be an issue of sort of it's like, how many options do I want there, right? And probably, I mean, you could do it and get like thousands of them, but I wonder if at some point you're splitting hairs and you're going to be diluting the pool you get back if you're going to have people in a later hit select which of these 4 options is the most readable summary of this written paragraph. If those hits are if those summaries are very similar,
Yeah.
you're going to probably get noisier data where it's like, all right, well, we had 1,000 options of this summary, and the differences between them are potentially negligible. So it's like, well, I got a whole lot for this one and 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 a whole lot, I mean, if you got thousands of them, it's like the differences between them get washed out. So in terms of how many of these do I actually want, I think a human manageable number, like 25. I don't think we want a ton of these. Even that might be slightly high. But, I think we want enough so that probably some variance would emerge, but stuff that we could still look at and read.
Yeah.
So like, if I get 100 sentences of why you selected this hit, I could read 100 sentences and manage them, right? Anywho, so all of this is kind of raising the questions of how are we structuring this? And in this first cycle, that's kind of how I've set it up. This boilerplate statement of here's what the study is, we're going to use your stuff. The Turker is answering one of 4 or responding to one of 4 prompts here. And the way to think of these is they're writing a summary of 4 different media types. It's either going to be a paragraph, a written paragraph, an image, an audio clip, or a video clip. But basically, you're probably doing the same thing, writing a 1-sentence summary of it. Then every one of these is going to have a 1-sentence prompt, 1 sentence of why you selected this hit. And, I was kind of toying with, should we allow them to write as much or as little as you want? Maybe that's an option there. Though I also do want to be kind of respectful of their time. I mean, I guess it is their time to spend, but it's sort of like, do I want a distilled statement in why you picked that, which makes it sort of easier for us to pull out elements. Here's why people we're doing these hits, right? Or do I want to give them the kind of liberty to say, you can put as much stuff as you want, with the, you know, the understanding it's like, if I don't stipulate how much I want, there's the possibility to get nothing or a couple of words, which may not be bad, but anyway. A question for on all of these that's a statement of, you know, why did you pick this? And then maybe something like, did you have any confusion about what this task asked you to do? Although again, that's kind of a yes, no question. And I'm not sure if what I get, you know, if we get all no's, it's like, well, okay. But I'm not exactly sure what that would tell me. I mean, I guess I could say, well, we wrote hits that were readable or you know, are able to be comprehended, right? Anywho, so that's the whole of what that first hit cycle would be.
Yeah.
And as I said, I think there'd be like 25. We'd ask for 25. We post this as 4 separate hits, right? And ask for 25 of each. That's kind of how I envisioned this. What were you thinking about this first cycle?
I mean, I was thinking in terms of, I mean, my way into this in part because we had looked at that, I forget now the piece that was talking about, I forget even what, I think it was IBM or something, you know, trying to generate these Microsoft trying to generate these sort of automated image descriptions. And so I actually was sort of focusing more on sort of the thing itself. So thinking about what kind of image would we want to put up that would sort of offer enough of a, right, and thinking in terms of the kind of stuff that we talked about, Sean, right, that there'd be foreground and background would both be, right, that you'd have, there's something about both of them. There'd be some kind of action or movement in it, and then some kind of emotional or affective register that would have to be dealt with. Well, what would it take to read all of those things and then to concisely summarize it? So I was sort of thinking in terms of less, I think which actually worked out well, right? Less in terms of what you put together, right? Sort of thinking about how the hit would actually be structured, and more along the lines of how would the hit be structured by the thing we wanted them to summarize, because that's in part what's going to, right? So in other words, right, the answer to some of those questions, right, that, you know, thinking about, was this a good use of your time? How long did this take you, right? One of the ways that we could theoretically influence the answer to those questions is by the complexity of the thing that we give them.
Yeah.
Right? The sentence is, you know, something from a children's book versus, you know, something from philosophy, right? The complexity of the object that we're having them describe will shape that task as well. In addition to or beyond how we actually compose the language of the hit, right? The actual the thing we put in front of them will have an impact on the hit itself.
Yeah. Well, so were you thinking primarily in terms of images as the?
I had primarily been thinking of images. That was mostly just, I think, off the heels of, I hadn't thought about like a sonic, you know, mostly because even in the first round, yeah, I had been solely thinking in part, I think, just in the milieu of the things we've been looking at, right? That getting a human being to do a task that various software companies were in the task of training bots to do, and in the context of hits, enrolling humans to help train bots to do that.
Yeah, and you know, if we had access to something like that auto caption generator or that auto, you know, that alt text generator that Microsoft is touting, or GPT-3, the study could potentially be very different, right? Where we'd be looking at potential comparisons between how humans and non-humans do this same task or whatever. Unfortunately, we don't have access to those things, right? So we are limited, because originally we talked about something like even having us write the hit text versus how would GPT-3 write this hit text, but unfortunately we don't have access to that. Excuse me. Well, I mean, one thing we might think about then is those parameters you discussed. I mean, one thing about having them look at different kinds of media is it potentially interrogates different notions of readability, right? So the readability of an image might be different than the readability of text or something like that, right?
Yeah.
Particularly as readability may address a kind of situational notion of like reading the room, right? Reading the scenario that we see depicted in an image or that happens in a video clip that might be different than the readability of a written passage itself. So we might think about those parameters that you were considering and how those might apply to potential different media.
Yeah.
So, I mean, like, the affective component, how would that manifest in a written text or a video clip or an audio clip? So what I guess I'm saying is those might influence our selection of those media samples, because right now I really don't have any, right now those are just kind of like almost random, right? Like I haven't even picked what would the paragraph be. And sort of as I haven't really thought about that. It's like, well, whatever, it doesn't matter, but it's like, maybe it does matter. Maybe we need to think about what are the dimensions of the media that we are asking them to engage.
Yeah.
Anywho, did you, in with the hits as you were seeing them, was like their primary, what they were doing was alt text, or were there any sort of meta questions, or what was the substance of the hit itself?
So I was thinking about, right, and I'd also been thinking in terms of like length too. So I was thinking about like what kind of character limit would we give them for various descriptions. Yeah, and then I had not yet really thought through the meta component as well, right? Sort of, in fact, that's why I'm glad you incorporated it, because that was one of the things I was sort of wanting to talk about today is how to set that up so it doesn't, right? Because it's potentially, as we've already discussed, right, it's potentially useful, but then how to fold it into the hit so it doesn't feel like, I mean, right now it sort of feels like an exit survey almost.
Yeah, and I mean that was it does, and in part I was sort of like, maybe that's why, in the boilerplate statement, if we're pointing out it has to do with research into comprehension or something like that, then if there are a couple of questions at the end, exit survey or sort of, metadata about the thing itself, maybe it seems a little less artificial if it's like, here are a couple questions about the study itself. I mean, remember how Kagel was talking about sort of notions of respect or participation?
Yeah.
Where if it's potentially framed as, was this survey fair or something? I mean, that's why I was kind of curious about those questions about like, were you fairly compensated? Was this a waste of your time or whatever? I mean, I don't know if I literally want those exact questions in there, but some notion of you're not just a subject.
Right.
I mean, at least we're conscious of the fact that you're doing this. It's kind of a fine line because I also didn't want to waste their time with a lot of instructional material. It's like, is it worth writing? We value you as a human being, and so we're going to ask you a couple of questions about your experience taking. It's like, that's potentially a waste. If you think of the scenario, it's like, I want to get through this as fast as I can to get on the next one. Instructional information that's overwrought is potentially counter to that.
Right. There's a sense in which in our desire to do that, do we actually produce the opposite effect?
Right. And I wonder if maybe
you respect me is by just letting me get in and do the hit as quickly as possible.
Right.
And don't ask me how I feel about it, because that's now another thing I have to do.
Which is sort of my approach to email, which I'm sometimes told I'm maybe a little brusque, because for me, this is stimulus response. I get a lot of email, so I don't want a lot of qualification about, how's it going? I need to ask you a favor. It's like, just tell me what you want and let me spit out the answer and let's move on, right?
No, the only thing worse than cross-posting is people apologizing for cross-posting. Just share your CFP and move on.
And you can see this manifest in similar. I anticipate a lot of Turkers have that same sort of just give it to me response, because you see it manifest in things like Stack Overflow, where a lot of meta discourse is heavily discouraged to the point you can even thank people. They don't want you to post, thanks. You try and do that, they'll remove it and they won't give you a stern talking to, because again, that'd be wasting your time. But they don't want that kind of thing. But I think maybe in the boilerplate, if we said something like, we're gonna ask you a question about, summarizing a piece of media or text or whatever, and then a couple of questions about the hit itself. And then that's literally what it is, right? One sentence about summarize this, and then literally maybe a couple of questions about, why did you pick this hit? And, maybe something about, were the instructions clear? Or was this compensation fair? Or anything like that,
I think that solution makes sense, right? Don't make it a exit survey, make it a part of the hit that's listed in the description and instructions for the hit.
Right. We could even put in I think this might be too much, but a statement about, because that's the other question is like, well, is the first thing a MacGuffin? And it's like, well, no, because we're going to be using your work in the future. But there might also be a statement there about the study is about comprehension, including, the comprehension of
the task.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's like, none of these are red herrings. God bless. None of these are red herrings. It's like, we're interested in kind of these different aspects of, part of me doesn't want to say readability, because as we'll see, maybe readability is going to be compared to other similar things that emerged in the first thing. But, is focusing on comprehension or focusing on instructions or focusing on how hits are written or something like that. Anyway.
Okay.
So that was the first hit. And then, as I mentioned, and as we kind of talked about before, if we envision this as sort of a two-parter, whoops, let me just share the thing itself so we don't get into a weird feedback loop here. Then the second one, which is in a sense kind of a little simpler, where what they're doing is selecting from the options that were generated previously. That might be a little tricky to set up, because it's like, ideally what you'd have is, let's say we have 25 of each of these, and we want them to be pulled probably randomly. And the reason why is you could manually set up different tasks where it's like, well, let's take the first 4 and you pick from the first 4 then the next 4, the thing of it is, then that means those are always the choices that are together, right? So it's like the best one of these 4, that's if they ask that same question, then what you're going to see isn't which one of these 25 is the most readable or whatever. It's which ones are the best of the 4 that they're always grouped with, right? So what you ideally want is sort of a random draw from that pool of 25. Here are 4, but it can't be completely random because you want each item to be presented ideally the same number of times.
Yeah.
It gets a fair shake. Otherwise, if it's just a random pull, statistically, it's like, well, one of them could never be shown, or one of them could always be shown. And so the results would be skewed just because of the number of times it's been seen. So from kind of a psychometric perspective, it's like, this one's a little trickier to set up. I mean, I think it's not that tricky because, I mean, there are tools that are devoted to this, that are devoted precisely to this kind of issue, where it's like, how do you present survey takers with a random sampling of options, but make sure that that sample is going to present each option an equal or almost equal number of times. There are tools precisely for this. So I don't think it's a big problem. It's just something to be conscious of.
Yeah.
Again, boilerplate about the study and its focus on comprehension or whatever. We don't need a statement here about your work's going to be used because it's not, it doesn't feed forward the way the first thing does. This one also is going to be compensated lower because you're not actually generating the written stuff. Really, all you're doing here is picking, right? It's like a couple of multiple choice questions is what this is. So it's not compensated at the same rate, seemingly. I mean, it's, there's a real question, of, as we looked at in the first one, the partnership between compensation and the work you're doing. The way I set this up, it's not compensated at the same level, but, maybe it should be, I don't know. Regardless, it's still going to be better than minimum compensation. The way I have this set up, literally this is like 4 multiple choice questions.
Yeah.
So, this would take you a couple of minutes. Anywho, so the boilerplate, the question here, where what we're doing is taking these and just asking, and it wouldn't be all 4 of them. And I don't think so. I think it would be each, it'd be divided by each one of these. So you would get a question here about, of these 4 summaries of this written paragraph, which is the most, and the way I envision this is we came up with some terms in the first product. Readable or readability is certainly one of them, but there were other ones that are related, but not the same thing.
Yeah.
Accurate was one of them that did come up. Relevant also came up.
That was one that was, yeah. And this was also related. I guess this is how I was thinking of the second one too, is one of the things I was thinking about is because I was focusing on alt text as my sort of way into this, is that in both phases, would we want to or need to or be interested in briefly, right? So should we essentially be giving them a rubric within the hit? Because once I did alt text, right, there are guidelines, various guidelines, mostly in accord, but some distinct differences about writing alt text. And so one of my thoughts was, if that's, in my own mind, right, that's at least what we were thinking about, right? If I was narrowing it down to, we're calling it alt text, that's what we're doing. Should we then in the hit give them guidelines about what good alt text looks like in the first phase when they're composing it? And then when we're asking them to then select the one they think is the most readable, we also then prime them by giving them criteria for what alt looks like.
Now, see, I thought about this too. And let me give you my my reasoning for why we don't do that. Here's why I thought about that too. Here's why I think we don't do that. Because that then presumes an answer in advance about what readability is, right? If we say, here's, generate readable this, and here's what we mean by readability. Or in the second thing, say, here's the guidelines for what readable is, pick out, the most readable one. We've already answered the question we want answered going into this. If what we want to do is to figure out how does readability emerge on the platform.
Yeah.
You know what I mean?
No, absolutely. No, I feel ashamed for having suggested it.
No. I wrestled with this too, because otherwise it's like you're just sort of saying, we'll just go do, we talked about this in terms of pedagogy, where if you just go tell a student, go do this, and then on the back end, you complain about, well, you didn't do what was in my mind. That's not fair, right?
Well, and I had also been thinking about it in terms of alt text on the heels of both our conversations with Sean, but also our conversations with Kegel, right? That there are, like, if we're asking them to engage in this, there's a community around this which has, I don't know. I mean, I guess to put it in the most basic terms, right, is there a kind of additional ethical layer of getting people to think through alt text and independent of a kind of community that has standards for alt text, which is a good point. But your point is, well, again, this gets, do we actually care about the alt text descriptions or not? I mean, I think it comes back to that issue. If we really do, then, but we don't in a certain, anyway, I think the point's taken though, is we don't want to, that's putting our thumb too much on it, right? We want to see how this emerges out of, well, yeah. Now I'm back on the other side in the senses which, well, we want to get a sense of how readability emerges from the system based on how a hit gets constructed. Would we get different ones if in the hit we include guidance for readability, right? Readability is still emerging in that system. Yeah, but I still think it's yeah.
Well, so there's multiple, I mean, the readability of the media we're providing or the readability of the hit itself, right? I mean, those are different potential things. But yes, it's true. Would we get different results if we wrote the hit differently? I mean, this is scratching the itch of, this notion of, were the instructions clear? I mean, that was one thing I wanted to sort of investigate, but that schism, I mean, that addresses that kind of schism. And, remember earlier we were thinking of leaning more toward that side of what response do we get from people when we ask it this way versus asking it that way, right?
Yeah.
Versus when we write it versus when GPT-3 writes it. What response do you get when we write it different ways? And in that kind of scenario, potentially the Turkers become more subjects because they're just the response, right? It's like, we wrote it this way, what happens? It's as though, I mean, imagine them as not humans, but as gravity. What happens when I do this? And, when I push this off the table, and here's what gravity shows me, versus what happens when I push that off the table. So yeah, I mean, originally we were leaning potentially more toward this notion of writing the hit differently and seeing what the feedback was. And, that's something potentially we can investigate. What happens when you just let people do it versus when you have guidance?
Yeah.
Anywho, oh God, man, we're already kind of running up against it.
It's just too exciting.
Yeah.
I mean, it really is like, this just reminded me yeah, and it may be broken again, but it does remind me, as I've collaborated with someone that's in social psychology, and we are really kind of bumping into these questions of prime and influence and, yeah, it's just, but also thinking about how the M-Turk situation itself folds is wrapped up into that. They're right. Everything we do while we're constructing this is a part of the thing.
Yeah.
There's no sort of, I mean, right. It goes back to that kind of really interesting conversation about subject or participant, right? There's really no way to not be a participant because this network is constructed entirely of participants at various stages, right? There's no way for us to interact with Mechanical Turks that isn't a part of making Mechanical Turks what it is.
Yeah. Well, and this may be because, I mean, you know, as I said, it's like, it's sort of an issue of, are we focusing more on how the Turkers are interacting with this stuff or how we're interacting with it as composers of these hits? Because, like, you know, even when I was writing the proposal for the grant proposal, because do you remember how we sort of had originally a more notion of what happens when we change parameters of the hit? What happens when we change the compensation level of the hit? What happens when we write it a different way? What happens when we give them a longer time? And there you could see we were much more on this notion of composing the hit and how that has different notions of readability in the response it gets. And as I've formulated them now, we've shifted much more. We've shifted away from that and much more to how does this notion of readability emerge in terms of Turker's readability with other kinds of media?
Yeah.
Now, either of them, any of these, I think, are fine. It's just we need to reconcile what is it we're after. What are we actually testing with it? I mean, this is an experiment. What are we actually testing? You know?
No, and that's, I think, yeah. And it strikes me that that's still TBD.
Yeah, it's an answer. Well, that's why, you know, like, and potentially what we see, because, you know, our task was to come up with these different hits. Potentially we diverged there. It's like, you know, mine are focusing more on these, and yours is potentially focusing more on the composition of the hit itself and what that means for readability.
Yeah.
Anywho, let me talk through the rest of this because we're almost a deadline. It feels like we haven't gotten through it. Anywho, so what this does is it asks them to select the most. And my thinking was we'd take these three emerged from the first product: readable, accurate, and relevant, you know, just sort of adjectives. Excuse me. So we use one of those and see how those results bear out. So if you ask people to pick the most readable summary of that paragraph, is there any meaningful difference from if you ask them to pick the most accurate or the most relevant of those? And here's where we're dealing in scale, right? This first hit, as it's structured, you're really only getting 100 responses, 25 for each type of media. Here you're going to be operating in scale because for each one of these four, you'd be asking three variations, right? One that says pick the most or select the most readable, one that says select the most accurate, one that says select the most relevant. And then there were a couple of metadata questions here as well. You wouldn't be asking for a statement of why you selected this hit, because then we'd have to deal with literally thousands, I would get thousands of statements there.
Yeah.
So if you're going to ask these kind of meta questions in the second round, they have to be something like a Likert scale or yes, no, right? Like, you know, do you feel you were fairly compensated? Or maybe, you know, a Likert scale for that. How satisfied are you with your compensation? You know, 0 to 5 or whatever. And then just this instructional question. So anywho, That's the gist of how these are structured. You know, the first round, we're asking them to provide summaries of different kinds of media, and then a couple of meta questions, and then a second round where people are picking those based on, are they readable or accurate or relevant, and then a couple of meta questions. That's the takeaway of how this is structured.
Yeah. No, and I think that structure makes sense. So yeah. Should we also, I'm wondering too, if in the first one, just as a sort of nod to the sort of participatory aspect, that even though people aren't, there's not going to be another step after this, should in the description of the second phase, should we point out that these descriptions that they're selecting from were generated in a previous hit by Turkers?
We can. Why would we do that?
I don't know.
I mean,
as a way of, I don't know. I mean, I'm thinking back to our discussion with Kegel, right? Is it at least the kind of acknowledgement that they're taking part, that even though what they're generating for this hit doesn't really go right, they're sort of more subject-y in this hit. They are taking part in a phased, right? Should basically, because the phase one points out that it's phase one.
Yeah.
The phase two point out that it's phase two.
Yeah. So maybe, yeah, in terms of transparency, or in terms of
right, that these descriptions or summaries were generated in a previous hit by Turkers.
Yeah, I mean, I don't see there's anything wrong with doing that.
Yeah, but I hadn't really thought of other than just my inherent need for symmetry, and again, thinking back to, you know, the kinds of things we talked about with Kegel, right? Does it, yeah, I don't know. Does it signal something about the hit, or does it change? Although again, right now, the question is, what impact does that have on the Turkers' relationship to that? Does knowing that the descriptions got generated by Turkers as opposed to us,
machine, or a machine, right?
Yeah.
Because I bet a lot of this is, you know, training a machine learning algorithm. So that's, you know,
right. That's a good point. It's probably safe to assume that the Turkers will assume that these descriptions we're having them pick from were generated mechanically.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. So I mean, there's nothing wrong. I don't think with
asking you to select from a randomized selection of descriptions written by Turkers in a previous hit.
Yeah.
Because that's interesting, right? Do they, I mean, that would be a whole other thing, right? I mean, the problem with thinking of this as an experiment is all we've done for the last hour is just generate a laundry list of independent variables.
Yeah. Well, yeah. Well, and that's, you know,
here's another confounding variable that I'm really interested in that we have no way of, right? Does knowing that it was written by a bot or a person affect how readable it is?
Yeah. And see, and that's the thing. It's like, it's a tough needle to thread to try and do everything, right? So, and it's probably not great practice.
I can't imagine any social psychologist listening to this conversation hasn't already reported us.
Yeah, because I mean, we want to try and focus down into what are you actually testing here, right? What are your actual variables? And so you want to control, right, the ones that that you do mean to control, and that way you can test the one. So here's one thing we might do is we might think in terms of next steps about pragmatically selecting material for Turkers to summarize, right? because that was something else is, where is this material coming from? Because there might also be kind of IP concerns with that, right? I mean, we can't just grab something. It has to be something we're allowed to use.
Yeah.
Or something we generate ourselves. So that way we control the IP.
Yeah.
But I mean, that might be something, because you mentioned, right? I mean, if we want them to provide summaries or captions or alt text or whatever, the media itself potentially should follow particular guidelines.
Yeah.
So, I mean, maybe what we should do is find actual examples here of, well, here's the image or images that, we would use. Here's the paragraph, Have you gotten as far as thinking about like those actual examples?
So I think I have to find it. I think I've sent it in the chat to you. So I found an image. For some reason, my instinct, I looked up. So I was just looking at stock photography.
Right.
There's one where I ended up finding it on a site for parents, and it's an image of a father feeding a baby, and it's sort of set in a living room, and it's got a background, and I mean the dad's doing that where it's making the face. The dad's making a face like open up as it's kind of mimicking. So I mean it basically is like trying to think about something where you'd want to describe this setting. You'd be describing a kind of activity, but then the actors engaging that activity, there's a kind of dynamic that you'd want to write. So that someone said dad feeding baby wouldn't quite, right? I was trying to capture an image where if someone just did the most basic, right, two figures around a table, right, wouldn't cut it, right? The dad isn't just feeding the baby. There's like a kind of mimicry or encourage, right? I was trying to find an image where would a not, like in terms of an alt text, right? I mean, because I was also looking at guidances for alt text, right? I could generate a description of this that would work, but wouldn't meet the guidelines for what a good alt text description could do, right?
Mm-hmm.
The dad feeding baby would sort of be like, well, okay, that is what's happening. But right, father encourages baby to eat, and then how would you do that in the most concise way? So I was sort of looking for images like that where there was a kind of, and given my own identity, right? Well, affectively would be there's, caregivers interacting with children. They'd be doing something, but there's an emotional valiance to it that you'd be wanting to also build into the description. Because it's not just it's not one subject feeding another subject. There's a relationship there that's important to making the image resonate.
And now, what are those that you've mentioned now? It was an action. It was, what are those now?
So that there's complexity in the foreground, and so that there's something about the setting matters, that you'd have to be able to pick what, there's enough going on in the image that you can't reasonably describe it all. So you've got to make decisions about what to describe. And that there's some kind of action taking place, right? There's movement or something like that, right? It's not just a stack of pancakes on a table.
Okay.
And then I also wanted it to have a kind of emotional valiance to it.
And where are you getting these? Are these things you're selecting, or?
Things I was kind of thinking about, right? And I was thinking about those aspects of readability, right? That going back to some of the hits we looked at where it's can you be able to discern, right? Like being able to discern the boundaries of an object, right? Like, which is a kind of basic task for looking at images. And then the other one, right? The one where it was, and then no, this is a car, and that car you're able to pick out from the street that it's on, but then you're also able to know that car is damaged or not.
Mm-hmm.
Right. So that there's a kind of, so I was kind of thinking about in those terms, and then just looking at various, I put the link somewhere. I was trying to find just guidance for writing alt text descriptions tend to focus on those, right? That don't just list what's in the image. You need
Right.
to describe how those things are related to each other.
Yeah. Well, and see, I think those are things we can potentially apply to things other than images.
Yes.
Right? Yeah. Well, yeah, I'm gonna have to wrap it up. We got another appointment. What we might do, I think, is try and find media that we can use that fits those kind of criteria, and that'll be something we'll have to do because it's like, I mean, as you mentioned, like a stock photo site, which is a good option as long as we have rights to use that, right? Because if we're going to be using this,
it's like Flickr's Creative Commons.
see, Creative Commons might be an option, right? Or public domain or something like that,
Or we can find, basic. There's got to be a public domain image of somebody feeding somebody.
Yeah. But things like audio and video clips might be a little bit trickier.
Yeah.
But that might be a place to look.
You could always make those too.
Well, that's the other thing is, do we just want to generate them and then you control the IP?
Yeah.
All right. Well, I think maybe we can do that and then we'll pick back up with this next time. Anything else?
No, this was good.
It's weird because we simultaneously want to do a lot of stuff, but it's like, to do this correctly, we need to focus down to like, what's the variable you're actually testing here? What's the dependent and independent?
Oh, that
our impulse is to make that larger. Well, what would happen if you did this? And what happens if you did this? And it's like, yeah, but I mean, if you want to do this, you're going to have to zoom down to 1, No,
and I think that's at least at this, 37 episodes in, that's our kind of cycle, right? We just, we really get big in terms of all the things we could do with this. And then I think after this episode, I think now we need to start, zooming in on, I still think it's an open question in terms of how much media that we want to give them. Because I really thought like, here's an image, write a description, that would be it.
Yeah.
But image, text, audio, video, right? Do we have them do all 4? That's something to think about too.
Yeah. And I mean, I don't imagine them doing all of those on the same hit, right? I mean, those are all separate hits. So when you get the hit, it's just a video clip. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Because I don't think I would ask him to do all of those on the same hit because that would be too much. And you'd be getting the same person's perspective on each one of those. I think what you want is to leverage scale by having.
That's true.
All right.
Okay. All right. Well, good work. And we'll see you around.
Yeah, I'll see you.
Okay. Bye.